Thank you very much. We've just had a, are somebody's moving things along or not? Oh, I am. I see.
There you go.
Ah, there you go.
Okay.
I was waiting for the slide to move, but I was responsible. I found that both the political background that we heard to begin with and the market context quite useful for what we're going to turn to now, which is a very specific policy context. This is U.S. policy. U.S. remains the largest exporter of cotton, and the next presentation will deal with the world's largest importer of cotton. And these are usefully put in the world context because, as our chairman pointed out, there are policies in other places in the world. There are certainly imports, exports, stocks held by other countries. But I think talking specifically about the United States and then about China is very useful for those of us interested in the world context. What I will be talking about is based on a paper, some work done by Christian Lau and my co-author Simon Schropp, who are from Sidley, Austin, here in Geneva. I can't let this slide go by without mentioning Scott Anderson, who's been a long-term partner with all of us on this work, as well as others at Sidley and Austin and colleagues that I have at the University of California as well. But this has been a team effort for since we are all very young men, I will say. The main points, let me get those out now. And one is that despite substantial changes in the U.S. Farm Bill that was finally passed last spring, there were substantial changes, and particularly for cotton. But cotton still continues to be heavily subsidized, as do several other crops. Brazil chose to discontinue the WTO case, the WTO challenge on cotton, but that did not mean that U.S. policy has no impacts on world price suppression, and this paper will document that. The U.S. policy has changed substantially, as I mentioned. It's moved heavily towards insurance-based policies. And one of the points I would like to emphasize is that calling it crop insurance doesn't mean it's not a subsidy. And we will document that for you in detail, particularly in the way it's done in the United States, but by extension to lots of other places around the globe. And then we used a well-established set of methods, plausible assumptions, I would argue, to simulate how subsidies and some market scenarios we'll describe, quite consistent with what we heard from the projections just a moment ago. That is, we have market context, we have policy simulations. We put this into a model that, as if you've looked at the paper, becomes quite elaborate and complicated. But what comes out is the effect of subsidies on the world prices. So our question for this part of the discussion today will be, if you change policies, how does that affect production in the United States, by extension then exports from the United States, and then the effects on the world prices. And then in some other work that I'm doing with some colleagues in France and in Belgium, what are the effects back into certain places in Africa? We're actually taking this paper, using survey data to trace it back into at the farm level in, say, Mali or Burkina or places in Africa, which I think is relevant. But for now, for today, we're going to stick in the United States. And here's where cotton's produced in the United States, starting in California, going around the southern part of the United States all the way up to North Carolina on the East Coast, with Texas in the center of things, and Texas by far the largest cotton producing area in the United States. To put this in context, I don't know what the European counterpart would be, but there's about 5,000 or 6,000 kilometers from California around to North Carolina here. So it's quite a distance. I was trying to say it's roughly from London to Moscow, but they said, no, it's much further than that. So anyway, it's quite a distance around here where they grow cotton in the United States. Here are some recent numbers that are very consistent with the international numbers. We just go back 25 years here, and with cotton acreage and production. And I note on here, cotton production is down to 9 million acres in 2015, again, consistent with the global numbers that we just saw. So the last point on the chart there is 2014. Cotton acreage is down. Of course, we don't know production yet. The harvest will be starting right about now for cotton in the United States. Now turn to the policy. The first thing that the 2014 Farm Bill was eliminate counter-cyclical and direct payments. So there were two policies that were eliminated. They both were among the least trade-distorting policies. There were a lot of money, but not independent of trade, but probably least trade-distorting policies. They took that money and then introduced a new policy called the Stacked Income Protection Plan. Everybody calls it STACS, and it's stacked on top of the current crop insurance program. So in a very long, forever, 15 or 20 years anyway, the United States has had a long-time crop insurance program that's evolved, and this new policy was stacked on top of that to provide additional insurance. And the marketing loan program remains. It was adjusted slightly, but it remains, as does the traditional crop insurance programs. When I say widespread, the cotton insurance covers 93% of cotton acreage. So essentially everybody who's commercially in the cotton business gets a very highly subsidized cotton insurance program that insures revenue, not just yield, but the actual revenue. So if price falls, they get an insurance indemnity. If yield falls, they get an insurance indemnity. And that falls relative to what some sort of expected value for that farm. The indemnity is then paid on the basis of revenue, based on some historical averages and some predicted prices. The stacked payment lays on top of that, so the typical farmer would buy insurance up if there was a shortfall in revenue below 70%, and then STAC sits on top of that, insures them from 70 up to 90%. So the farms have 90% of their revenue assured by a very heavily subsidized government programs, and that's really crucial because cotton revenue in the United States is quite variable, and if you know anything about agriculture, a guarantee of 90% of your revenue is incredibly valuable for farmers. It allows them to go to their banker in the U.S. context and get loans at much lower interest rates. It allows them to feel very secure about growing cotton in particular, because cotton is among the most variable crops. Texas in particular, where 60% or so of the crop is grown, has extremely variable weather conditions for cotton. Often they will plant a cotton field and then abandon that field later, heavily subsidized based on that abandonment. They've insured against the potential abandonment of that acreage. And the premium subsidies themselves are 90%. I'll just mention in passing, there's lots of other subsidies that end up meaning the total effective subsidy is 80, 90, 100% of the total of what would be a normal premium if this were really commercial insurance. So we simulate the effects of these subsidies. I'm not going to go at all into the details of this modeling. We have to predict what farmers might expect yields and prices to be, how they would behave in the face of these subsidies. We use data from 600 individual small counties around the country where they grow cotton. We take 20 years and then we develop distributions of those. We have a probability distribution of yields and prices, build a probability distribution of revenues from that, take 10,000 draws out of a random sample to generate those numbers, and then generate from that an expected subsidy for each farm, depending on what they think price is going to be during that year. So you can see there's lots of scenarios at play behind this model. What are the results, which is what we're all interested to hear. If this were an economics seminar, I would have spent an hour on that model. But for today, I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes about the results. The prices, we looked at a whole range of price scenarios. I'll mention 4 of them here, including the 70-some cents that we just heard from the ICAC is the third scenario down. That would leave an expected market. These are expected subsidies. So when the farmer's planting, what matters to the farmer is how much they think they're going to get. $190 million in marketing loan payments. Crop insurance subsidies is called SIP, crop insurance program. Net indemnities of about $600 million, another $700 million from the STACS program, $1.5 billion in subsidies that farmers could expect to receive from these programs. Here's the full range of scenarios that we looked at in chart form. And if prices are high, surprisingly, high prices, if you're ensuring the expectation of high prices, get you very high subsidy rates. So in fact, the highest subsidies are when prices are highest, oddly enough. But throughout this, you can see for every scenario we look at, more than $1 billion worth of subsidies to the cotton industry expected by producers as they consider growing cotton versus some other crop. What does that mean as a share of market revenue? Now, here you see a different picture. If prices are very low, the subsidies are 90% of the market revenue. That is, almost half the revenue that a farmer expects to get in that scenario is made up by subsidies, meaning the farmers in the United States don't worry nearly so much about low market revenue as they would in pretty much everywhere else in the world, because that's going to still be made up in this way under an insurance scheme by the federal government of the United States. But even at very high very high prices, the farmers are expecting more than a third of their revenue. 33% of market revenue is equal to the subsidy rate, broken down into the three pieces that were on the previous slide. But what does it really mean to the rest of the world? That's the price suppression question. And to get to here, we take our model of the U.S. market and the U.S. policy and link that with our model of the world market and ask, how do U.S. prices translate, U.S. subsidies translate into world market prices? And that depends on whether the U.S. is a big part of the world. Well, we just heard it continues to be the world's largest exporter. So if the United States grows more and exports more, that will affect world prices, and that's what we trace through here. It depends on the supplies and the demands and the substitutions with other commodities and the non-cotton textile fibers. All of that is built into a model, as simple as a model as we could develop, to say how do world prices. And what does it mean if at the low side, U.S. cotton policy would be expected to depress world prices or suppress potential increases by 11%, and for all the scenarios, at least a 6% price suppression. So if we think about what that means, say, for example, in Burkina Faso, it means that as their trading company gets lower prices, that works through their system back to an individual farm, and that individual farmer makes a few $100s less money in cash income. Because for these farms, this is the cash crop, in cash income, and that affects how they live. It affects whether their children go to school, how well fed they are, whether someone has to work off the farm at potentially dangerous occupations. Just the whole context of the rural community is affected by lower cotton prices that trace through to those farmers. This paper doesn't do that whole trace through. For this project, we stopped with what does it mean to this world price suppression. So quickly, the 5 points. U.S. programs did not disappear with this farm bill. They're still there. They became insurance policies. It turns out insurance policies have very substantial effects on production, as you would expect. It's intuitive. The subsidies stimulate extra cotton production that depress world prices at least 6% by our calculations. That means, and particularly in the very poor countries, there are millions of people still vulnerable based on these subsidies. And I want to end by saying this. This is an example of the United States. I think Andrew, our chairman, emphasized a very important point. The U.S. subsidies are not